Great. So, hi everybody. My name is Sam Sklar. I am a city planner. I'm trained a transportation planner. I'm based out of Brooklyn, and City Power is my favorite planning book. So I wanted to have a chat with the author, Professor Richard Schrager, who's joining us this evening, and to kind of talk about the book a little bit and give everyone an introduction to what it says, what it means for you and your work, or you and your hobby of being an informed urbanist. So I want to welcome everyone for hanging out this evening with us for about an hour. I am recording this, so if you've got a friend you'd like to send this to later, or you want to watch it again, we'll let you know where that's posted after we're done. But I want to get going. I want to get started. So I'd like to introduce Professor Schrager, and who better to do it than the professor himself.
Well, thanks, Sam. It's great. It's terrific to be here. Thanks for organizing this. This is really nice. You write a book and you send it out in the world, and often you don't get much in response in terms of folks. They might be reading it, they might not be. So it's really nice when folks reach out and have nice things to say and set these things up. This is great. So thank you, Sam. I appreciate it. I hope everybody's safe and well out there. I'm here in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm a law professor at the University of Virginia School of Law. I've been doing this for almost 20 years here, and I teach property, a basic first-year property course, and a course called Urban Law and Policy, and also state and local government law. I also write a little bit about church and state issues, though they don't overlap as much with local government issues, though more than you might think. I'm a little bit of a frustrated urban planner and urbanist, so I've decided to use my time as a law professor to kind of reach over and read and absorb and engage in some of the things that maybe many of you are interested in and are engaged in. Certainly hoping to have a audience and a conversation with folks like Sam and others on this call who are interested more broadly in cities, urbanism, planning, federalism, how cities work. I live in a small town, but it has some of the features of a kind of a city-suburb dynamic here in Charlottesville. And so it's a little bit of a microcosm of an urban-suburban dynamic, though less so than obviously other places. I've lived in a lot of cities across the country in my previous lives. So that's what I do, and this book is part of my long-term work that I've been doing a lot. I mostly have written for law review audiences, so other law professors who teach in kind of the state and local government law space. But part of the purpose of this book was to reach out to other audiences and to talk across disciplines. And so I hope we can do that and have a nice conversation today and take your questions about the book. If you've read the book and you have enjoyed it, that's great. And if you have questions, as I'm sure you will, I'm happy to take those. If you haven't read the book, that's great too. I urge you to go and grab it if it's interesting to you and if you find this conversation interesting. But again, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Absolutely. So just a quick word about kind of how this is going to run today. It's nominally a conversation between Professor Schrager and me, but we want to make this fun. So if you've got a question, feel free to type it in the chat or ping me and I will unmute you so you can ask the question. Like I said, for people just joining, this is being recorded, so I just want to make sure that everyone is clear that this will be posted for friends or for you to rewatch later, and that means I also have to remember to speak slowly. So the reason why I reached out to Professor Schrager is because this book was introduced to me by a good friend of mine. Her name is Alex Baca. I don't know if she's in the chat or if she'll be joining us, but her interests are closely aligned with mine in trying to figure out why cities don't work the way we think they do, or why the policy that we think is great and going to affect a lot of people's lives actually doesn't do that. And from my work and my research and my education as a planner, what I learned at school was a lot of the data techniques, a lot of the design techniques. But what I was desperately missing was a little bit of a dive into the law and the policy and the politics of why cities behave and why actors within cities and counties and states and all the levels of government, which I'm sure we'll get into, behave the way they do. And a lot of it comes down to human interaction. But as the book kind of cites and talks about over its 200 something pages, a lot of it is dictated and determined by laws that have been either written or adjudicated upon at all levels of courts. So I guess the first thing is, in a couple sentences or a couple minutes, can you kind of summarize what the biggest takeaway of this book is for the general audience?
So yeah, sure, Sam. I'll try to do it in a few words or less. But of course, I tend to get excited, so there may be some longer claims being made. But let's see how it goes. Let me first say, I wrote this book because there, at least on the law side, there was a kind of static view of local governments and particularly cities. And that static view was basically that, and this was in the political science literature as well, that cities were basically open economies. They had limited capacity to control their economic fates. Because whatever kinds of policies they adopted could lead to capital and persons fleeing the jurisdiction. They could leave the jurisdiction. And so this is a famous thesis by a guy named Paul Peterson writing in the early 80s. His book was called City Limits. And my book's actually purposefully entitled City Power because it resists that claim. The claim was that there's not that much interesting about cities. What they do is they try to attract capital and labor, and they have to have a kind of growth agenda to secure their economies and make the city work. And they're in competition with each other, and they're in competition with other cities in the state, in the nation, and across the globe. And this kind of competitive model has been dominant, and it was dominant in the legal literature too. So that meant that city politics wasn't that interesting. People fought about various things, but ultimately there wasn't a lot of room to maneuver for cities. And I'm resistant to that, and the book is resistant to that too, but it's resistant to it in a kind of awkward way or a little bit quirky way. And this is the way this goes. What they were telling cities, you have to have low taxes, you have to have business-friendly regulation, you have to have no minimum wage, you have to be very attentive to your position in the global economy. Because if you do that, you will induce growth, you will induce economic growth. And my claim in the book, one of the central claims in the book, is that there's not a lot of evidence for anything that a city would do to induce growth. Therefore, there's not a lot of evidence that there's anything that a city would do that would prevent growth. That is, growth, economic growth is a false constraint on city power. That's the way I put it in the book. What is the constraint on city power? Well, here's the second claim. City power is constrained by politics. Now, this might not come as a big surprise to people who watch the city and watch its politics. But what I mean by politics is, I mean, in the United States, at least, we have a system where states are supreme and exercise a great deal of authority and primacy. And that kind of state-based federalism is bad for cities. It creates weak cities. And that is a political choice that we've made as Americans, in part, not so consciously, but through a constitutional system that treats cities as secondary entities politically, and also creates a system by which it's in the interest of state officials and federal officials, for that matter, to limit the power of cities and limit the things that they can do. And so that's where we are. So the two big takeaways: growth is a false constraint on what the cities can do. They can do more than those things. They can do redistribution, for instance, and we can talk about what that looks like. And two, the constraint on cities is not so much economic, which is the old kind of model, it's political. And it's a function of political structure, that is state-based federalism. And it's a result of a lack of political will in the national community, but in specific states too, to allow cities to exercise power. My normative take on all this, that's the descriptive claim, and it's pushing against these other claims. But I have a normative take, which we can talk about, which is I want cities to exercise more power. I think they should. I think it's where many of the most crucial and important and serious issues that we face come to a head. We've seen that, for example, in this COVID crisis, for sure. And what we are seeing is city-state conflicts, city-nation conflicts, and that's in part a function of a federal system that is quite hostile to city power in the United States. And for me, this book is a call to arms, in part, for anybody that's interested in cities or like cities or is thinking about federalism or local power. It's a call to arms to say, hey, cities should have more power. It's not just that they can exercise more power descriptively if they're given the opportunity, but they should. It's desirable that cities exercise more power. And that's the basic message I hope that people take from this book.
That was as concise as I could have hoped for. That is,
oh, well, thanks, Sam.
Exactly the takeaway that I got from this book when I first read it. And I've read this book once a month for the last couple of years, probably, or once a quarter. It's just my book is marked up like mad, and I've got tabs. It's my planning Bible. Not to hype up a little too much, but I can't say enough about it. As all my friends in this chat I think are aware of, my first question about something you touched on there is the concept of federalism, which I think is one of the central theses of this book. And to our friends in the audience, can you talk a little bit more about what federalism is, kind of where it came from, and the two chapters that you have in this book talking about vertical federalism and then horizontal federalism?
Yeah, so the term federalism is used is in law schools is mainly used to describe the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. And as everyone knows, the federal government is understood as a government of kind of limited powers, articulated in the Constitution of the United States, and there's fights in the Supreme Court about the extent of those powers. And then the states have the kind of residual authority, what they call the police power, health, safety, and welfare, and they get to do everything else. And what we've seen, for example, again in this pandemic, is a lot of conflict, right? That is a function of a federal system, which we hope is a cooperative system between the center and the states, between the federal government and the states, but has turned into, at least recently, into a kind of cutthroat federalism, which allows the center, in this case, the president, to pit states against each other and so on and so forth. That's not quite how we think it should work. But what you have is a system whereby states have certain authority for some things, the federal government has certain authority for other things. There's overlapping authority, but there is a sphere, a constitutional sphere, where states are allowed to do things, but the federal government's not allowed to do things. That's the structure of state-based federalism. In terms of cities, what governs the relationship of the city to the state is state law and state constitutional law. And some state constitutions provide what's called home rule to cities, and that gives some authority to cities to do things without the express authority of the state. But that's limited. And in fact, generally state legislatures and the governor have pretty absolute authority over their local governments. There's some room for local governments to do other things, but generally they have this kind of authority. In terms of the vertical relationship, and what the book talks about is, a lot of people think that the United States is a highly decentralized political system, and more decentralized than other political systems. And that's true to some extent. But what you have in a system like ours is 3 tiers of government. You have the federal government, the state government, and the local government. And the local government, while not constitutionally recognized, is obviously an important aspect of federalism. So we don't have just 2 levels of government, we have 3. Now, it turns out the problem with state-based federalism is that the states and state officials tend to have an interest in intervening in local affairs only when it's convenient for them to do so. That's because their political incentives are such that they want to take credit for good things like cutting taxes, but they want to push off the blame for bad things like not providing services to the lower level of government, so that they can avoid responsibility but take credit when they can. And remember, state legislators, state officials often are also representing local people, just not the city as a whole, right? They come from a local district, but they don't represent the city's interests. And so what you get is this form of redundancy where there's competition between state officials and local officials, between federal officials like the state's representatives and senators, and all that competition, political competition, often leads to the local government officials that represent the city directly. It often leads them to lose. They're weak political actors in a system that has a lot of redundancy in it. That's the vertical part. The horizontal is, what is the relationship between cities and between states? And we saw questions, for example, during the pandemic about, can a state close its borders to other people in other states? And that's tricky in our federal system. There's constitutional law that says they really can't. There might be a pandemic exception, but you're not supposed to close your borders. But what we see at the local level often is mechanisms that local governments sometimes use to try to control the entry of people and capital into the jurisdiction and limit how it can leave. And so what we see a lot of is competition between jurisdictions, cities in particular, but states also. Competition for capital, like the Amazon fight, or the subsidies that were offered to Amazon, and competition for individuals. So things like exclusionary zoning, or zoning which tries to attract a certain kind of person. And so what we do see horizontally is cities and states, local governments of all kinds and states, trying to attract capital that they like and reject capital that they don't like, or reject costs that they don't like. So what do states want? They want investment. They want corporate monies. They want what I call in the book mobile capital. And they don't want poor people. And they don't want costs, because costs cost them in terms of tax money and tax base. So that form of competition, it can be problematic, and also leaves cities in particular in a kind of weak position, because what they're doing is they're competing for capital with other cities, or at least they think they're supposed to be competing for capital with other cities. And the mobile capital, which are corporate monies, investment, highly desirable labor, individuals, those folks are driving this system.
That is the overall takeaway, I think, from those chapters. I think definitely there are some great examples of situations in the book that describe situations. one of the most, I guess, popular or known about battles in this country between state and local officials is in my home state of New York, between the Mayor Bill de Blasio, and the governor, Andrew Cuomo. And we just talked about how cities aren't federally chartered, they're chartered by their state constitutions. And my question is, why doesn't Andrew Cuomo just revoke the city's charter? If he's so concerned about absolute power over our mayor and the way things work, why doesn't he just kind of revoke the charter? Because I guess he or the legislature are capable of
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah. So it's a fair question. So I think we start with the background presumption, which is localities, cities don't have any federal constitutional right to exist. That is, this is the plenary power idea. What the U.S. Supreme Court has said is the state can do whatever they want with their local governments, say the city of New York. Now, in New York and other states, there are both state constitutional recognition of certain kinds of local governments and statutes that allow you to create a local government or to charter your city or to have a chartered county. Now, the legislature could modify that. And in the past they have allowed cities to swallow up other cities or eliminate cities, right? The city of New York swallows up Brooklyn. That was that they were able to do that because state law permitted them to do that, right? And there might be constitutional restrictions on eliminating local governments if they're chartered cities, for example, in the Constitution. Sometimes they are. But that Constitution could be changed. So it might be that you could amend the Constitution to get rid of cities, or they might just be, as a matter of statute, recognized, and you can get rid of them that way if you wanted to. But it would take an act of the legislature, and we've had annexation and secession kind of fights in the states for a long time, where cities take over other parts of cities or parts of counties, or counties resist that, and we have incorporation fights. So it's not that the state isn't active in deciding how many local governments there might be. They do. They decide the boundaries and they decide how this works. But I think there's a political point behind your question, Sam, which is, well, what is this power play? How does this work between Cuomo and de Blasio? Well, it turns out Cuomo just has a lot of cards to play, and he's perfectly happy to let de Blasio be the mayor of New York City as long as Cuomo can come in every once in a while and get exactly what he wants. And that's what you're seeing there, is that Cuomo gets to come in when he wants to and take credit or intervene at the moments where it's politically expedient for him to do so. He doesn't have to, though, run the city. He doesn't want to run the city. It's not politically expedient for him to do so. And so what you see a lot of is state officials, governors, legislatures, they come in, they do something, but they don't want to run the show. They want somebody else to run the show, as long as they don't run it too far out of line with their interests. And so that's why politically it's expedient for state officials to have local governments to run the show, but it's also nice for them to do what I call selective interventions or selective localism. They come in and they intervene when it's convenient for them to do so.
That's an excellent answer, and I think that's probably right. And a lot of it comes down to the voters who, New York City's voters who vote for both the mayor and the governor are either unaware purposefully, they don't know. I mean, a lot of questions that I'll ask a couple people on the street is, who runs the MTA?
Correct.
And you'll get a lot of times the mayor or the council, or the MTA is a separate agency, when in fact it's a state-run agency, and Andrew Cuomo has, nominally the authority to do with it what he will.
Right.
And so it's a question, I think, of kind of increasing the information, but it's maybe not politically expedient for Cuomo to kind of increase the amount of information around his actual power here.
Yeah, and this is something we face all the time. So in Charlottesville, we had Charlottesville in 2017 neo-Nazis came to protest the removal of, or the proposed removal of some Confederate monuments. It was a very traumatic episode in the life of our little town here. And there were a lot of fingers pointed at the city government and the city manager and the mayor. It turns out, well, the mayor is not directly elected. The mayor is just elected by the council, and the council is also not in charge of a lot of things. The city manager is in charge of a lot of things. And it turns out most of the things that people are upset about are things that state law dictates. For example, the city of Charlottesville couldn't have its own gun regulations. City of Charlottesville could not remove the Confederate monuments because there was a state law preventing them from doing so. City of Charlottesville could not have a whole range of things like housing, pro-housing policies because the state had prevented that. So lots of people in lots of jurisdictions are confused about who actually makes the rules. And in many cases, it's the state making the rules, and the city doesn't have the kind of autonomy that many people would think that they might have.
Exactly. And it kind of varies state by state, the relationship among the different power players. And, we'll lump in with local government, also regional governments that
Right.
have, it's another layer, but they're also not necessarily federally chartered. So we got a couple questions from our audience. And so, Jake, I can unmute you and you can ask this question, or I'm happy to ask it myself. What would you prefer? Kind of me? Great. So Jake Schmidt asks, your phrasing, I believe, was that economic growth is a false constraint on city power. Is your belief that economics don't constrain cities at all, or is it more like that political constraints are tighter so that economic limits don't bind? He follows up, says he's sure it's clear, he just hasn't read the book yet.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jake. That's a great question. And it's really a central one that the book tries to answer, asks and answered. And what the claim looks like the following, which is there seems to be, and this is something that people on all political sides sometimes have trouble with and resist, which is I make a claim in the book that cities have less control over their economic fates than we think they do, which is a claim that says economic development policy or economic growth policy is not something that cities are either good at or really have control over. It's frankly not clear if states or nations have control over it either, to be honest, but let's just stick with cities. But the claim of a competitive interjurisdictional system assumes that cities have some level of agency over their economic growth and decline. But if economic growth and decline is a process in which it's very hard to predict what will lead to growth and what will lead to decline, which is one of my claims in the book, then that allows cities to do things that some would accuse them. They would say that's bad for economic growth or economic development, like redistribution, like a minimum wage, for example. Lots of people said, well, that'll just destroy your economy. Turns out it didn't, right? In lots of these places, not all these places, but lots of these places. So one of the claims of the book, and I think the first couple of chapters tries to do this work, is we don't know, and we're very bad at predicting when a city will rise and when a city will fall. So no one really predicted in 1954, when Detroit was at its peak, that it would be in such severe decline. They would have probably bet on in 1970 and 1980 and 2020 that Detroit would be the biggest city in the world. Why? Because economically it was running on all fours, all cylinders. It was a machine, right? And it had lots of technology. It had oil, gas, plastics, electronics, a whole series of sub-industries that were related to the car industry, the automotive industry. It looked like it was going to just keep growing forever, and then it declines fast. In the 1970s, by contrast, you might not have bet on New York City at the time that it went into basically receivership, right, when it went bankrupt. You would not have predicted, and no one did, that New York City would suddenly be the epicenter, essentially the epicenter of the world. economy, and certainly the national economy. It's almost 10% of the GDP, I think, are some of the numbers, some crazy number that we've seen. So we don't know. We just don't know. So part of the book is a plea for a kind of modesty about our claims about what policies might lead to economic growth and decline. And economic growth and decline is a very big deal in terms of the welfare of the citizens in the city, right? It's very hard to do anything as a city if you don't have economic growth, development, all kinds of stuff. But if you conclude that it's really hard to figure out what does the work of economic growth, and in fact we have trouble predicting, and in fact the reasons for the economic resurgence of cities in the last 20 years are unclear, then why would you listen to people who say, well, just have business-friendly regulation, just subsidize huge corporations, right? Give them lots of money. Just have a low tax environment. If none of those things actually has anything to do with growth or decline, then you could do some of those things if you have the capacity, and lots of cities don't because they just don't have the budgets. That's different from economic growth. They don't have the revenue. And so then it seems to me it opens up the possibility for minimum wage laws and other kinds of laws, which people sort of neoclassical economists would say, this is terrible, don't do this. And it turns out they can do it. So I think there's just more room for maneuver. If you're asking about revenue capacity, certainly a city that's in fiscal distress doesn't have the revenue, right, to do the work. And what I say in the book is, what I think cities should do is invest in basic municipal services. They shouldn't try to do flashy stuff. They shouldn't try to attract mobile capital. We don't know if that's going to work. It probably won't, actually. That's a mistake. What you do is you invest in basic municipal services. We have a moral obligation to do so, right? Housing, healthcare, safety and security, and education. Those are kind of the basics. Try to do those as well as you can. And when cities are in decline, there is a role for the state and national government. Obviously, we're seeing this in the pandemic, to come and support them. And we should think of cities as not on their own. They have to compete with each other, right? They have to compete. And if Detroit goes, it's because they were mismanaged. That's the argument. Well, that's silly. That's not a great argument. If Detroit collapses, it's because actually there's some economic cycles that are happening, and some cities are rising and some are falling. And what we should think about a system of cities in a nation is that some are going to rise and some are going to fall, and you need to even out those booms and busts. What we do in this country is basically we say, you're on your own for the most part. Not wholly, but a lot. You're on your own, and you got to figure out, Detroit, how to attract capital, right? You, New York, have to figure out how to attract capital. And you're doing it wrong, right? You're doing it wrong. That's why you're in decline. That strikes me as quite silly. So there are constraints. There are revenue constraints, not the theoretical constraint of growth. That's the nature of the argument. I hope that's helpful.
One of the central takeaways about mobile capital from the book, for me as a planner, and this is how I try to tie everything back to my professional experience, is that CEOs and people who make these decisions on where the mobile capital goes want to live and work in places that are beautiful, that provide the services, that kind of create this fun environment where they can attract the best employees. And if they've got kids or a dog or activities, they can access these things with ease. And I think there's a long kind of legal and popular discourse about if you just offer the tax break, or you just kind of build this massive bypass, a big highway expansion in a place that's kind of out of the way, rural or more suburban, that the company will just come. One of the most famous cases that we have that kind of set legal precedent for this was Kelo versus New London. A more popular one is the Foxconn case in Wisconsin. And kind of in the more recently is we talked about the HQ2. Amazon was looking to I don't need to repeat this, but Amazon was looking to kind of build a second headquarters outside of Seattle and shrewdly put out a request for proposals that over 280 cities and other project sponsors, I think some counties and maybe on behalf of cities, submitted these applications. Why? I mean, first, two questions. Why would Amazon put this request for proposal out there if we all kind of think, and from reading the book, we could have likely predicted what was going to happen? Why put out the proposal in the first place? And then the follow-up question is, why do you think the other applicants, so outside of New York and DC, why do the other applicants spend so much time and resource on putting an application together like this to apply for the headquarters?
Yeah, so the motives are, when put in motive terms, it's maybe hard to answer. There's lots of possibilities. I think in a kind of a general pitch, when a company looks for subsidy, and the more powerful they are, and they're going to look around to get money, right? They're not stupid, and they're going to get, even if it's not that big in terms of the bottom line, it's better than nothing. And so getting tax breaks is part of the game now. Location incentives have been around forever. I've got quotes in the book from the 19th century where they're saying, this is what towns and cities are doing across the country. They're trying to steal industry from each other. They're trying to attract railroads. They're trying to attract electric companies. They're trying to bring in industry. And this is from 1890. So this just keeps going. And it is a feature of this idea that mobile capital has to be attracted. And there are political interest groups in these places, in these towns, in these cities who will benefit, right, from the attraction of this capital. It's often pitched as a job creator, and local governments local government officials have a strong incentive to say, oh, I created jobs for you. I brought jobs in. Of course, often those jobs are filled by people that migrate into the city because now there's a big company there. So it's not the people that live in the city already necessarily, it's people from outside. Why? Because labor markets are regional and national. So labor is going to come. So you actually sometimes get increased unemployment when big companies come in. Why? Because more people are pouring into that jurisdiction. So jobs is a big thing for local politicians to be able to wave around, and especially state politicians. A lot of those Amazon bids were subsidized by states. In Virginia, which we didn't reject it, that was a lot of state money, not just local money. And that's because the numbers are big. So we do this with stadiums, right? Stadiums and attracting professional sports teams. We do it with industries like the Pfizer plant in the Kelo case in New London's instance. We're doing it with Amazon HQ too. Now, why did they do it? Well, my understanding is they thought they'd get a lot of information about these places from their kind of submissions. And then, yes, I think had they read my book, you might have predicted that where they'll go is to either New York or Washington, D.C. area or some metropolitan area. Why? Because what the book says is, listen, the advantages of agglomeration economies in certain kinds of places in big metropolitan areas are quite high. This is why firms will pay very high rents to be in Manhattan when they could pay relatively lower rents just across the river in New Jersey or really low rents in Alaska. So, but why are they paying high rents in Manhattan? Because there's an economic reason for them to be there, just like they're paying high rents in LA or Chicago or Paris or Rome or Tokyo. If that's the case, then it's overdetermined that those companies will end up there. Especially companies that are relying on technology, knowledge economies, all that stuff. And so, so it was overdetermined. It was predictable that they would end up there. It doesn't matter how much Ithaca, New York, or whoever it was, would spend, or Buffalo, would spend in terms of subsidies for Amazon. Those subsidies can't counteract the value of being in say, New York or in Washington, in the Washington area. And as Sam points out, there may be amenities too the amenities can come and go for the workers who want to be there. I think there was an old study where the location of an industry or business was related to the distance to the CEO's home. And, and so where a CEO wants to live, if that's what's driving location decisions, then what are we doing? Like, let's stop doing what we're doing, which is spending money to try to attract, and let's start just spending that money on basic municipal services. Let the economy do what it's going to do. I just don't think we should be we should have, and what I'd say to people is, we should not have a local industrial policy. It's not a good idea.
And I think even the best evidence against subsidizing this local industry is the outcome of the Keeler versus New London case. I mean, Pfizer essentially paid off the city to kind of overextend its takings power and wound up not even siting a plant in New London. They moved next door to Groton, where there were more, I think, available. I think that maybe the land was cheaper and there were more ready and willing employees. I mean, who knows? But
yeah. After
all that, the outcome was nothing. They got nothing for it except now constitutional precedent, or a Supreme Court set precedent of being careful with the takings clause.
Yeah, and Sam, this goes to your point of why did folks do this? So I put this question to my property law students all the time. I say, so you're the city council of New London, and you've got 20% unemployment, and you're a distressed municipality, and the state comes to you with, say, 20 million, and Pfizer comes to you with some money, and you don't have to put a ton of money in as a city. Are you going to vote for that? And they promise you 1,000 jobs. Are you going to vote for that? Yes, of course you're going to vote for that, even if you have to condemn a few neighbors' houses. And the reason you're going to do that is because what choice do you have? And part of that is because we allow New London and lots of Connecticut cities, right? One of the richest states in the nation is Connecticut, but the cities are incredibly poor. We allow New London to decay and to be in fiscal distress because we say you're responsible, right, for figuring out how to do this, as opposed to thinking some cities are up, some cities are down. It depends on the economic cycle, and we need to assist cities to provide the basic services that their citizens should have, and eventually they'll come back up. But then we do silly things. We say to New London, create an arts district, right? Create condos, dudes, right? Pfizer will come in and you'll have this. This strikes me as pretty nutty.
Let's move on to some more questions. We have a couple of questions here from our audience. One is, we can easily apply the state and local federalism discussion to the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. Can you suggest any solutions for reducing competition and redundancy in the current situation in the New York context?
Yeah, so I just think what we've got is a kind of, one is in the pandemic, you've got different untapped authority sources. So it's not clear, what does the governor get to do? What does the mayor get to do? My view of this has been, and we see this, say, in Georgia, where the Georgia governor wants to open up and has, and the Atlanta mayor is like, this is crazy, don't do this. I think I have said that we should defer to mayors more than we do, and city, obviously the book is about allowing cities to make some decisions that are otherwise made by others. I think the fights between Cuomo and de Blasio about who gets to open the schools or close the schools are kind of bizarre, right? I don't know why the governor gets to decide who opens and closes the New York City schools. But again, this is just a good example of where the authority is so overlapping, and where the governor or legislature wants to intervene when they disagree about the policies that the locals are making. And you could constitutionally and legislatively be more clear about who gets the authority. And maybe we'll do that when we look back at kind of emergency response. But it seems to me the mayors are on the front lines of this, and I think have less incentive, not always, but less incentive to act ideologically. I don't, that's can be debatable, and I think people can call that, call me on that. But I think they tend to act slightly less ideologically than, say, the governors, or certainly than the president of the United States, I think, at this moment. And so I would give more authority to the local. But the reason that we're seeing this is described, as I describe it in the book, in that chapter on vertical federalism. The reason that we're seeing this conflict and this difficulty and this inability to cooperate is because of the political dynamics of states having redundant authority over cities.
Great. I think that's a great answer. I hope that answered your question, Olivia. Next question, let's kind of do a run of questions, just to kind of include everyone here. We have a question from Professor Greg Schill from the University of Iowa.
Hi, Greg.
Let's not get too wonky here. Let's keep it at the top level.
Okay.
But he says, "Hi, Rich. How does one balance the desire for greater city power vis-a-vis states?" He says a normative goal he supports, with intra-municipal power dynamics. That is a mouthful. Yeah. Where those who support the status quo enjoy disproportionate power and the lack of party competition. He says all cities are democratic, makes it difficult to effectively politicize issues.
Yeah. So I guess I think, so right, one of the worries and one of the claims about this local governments or cities is that they're, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, in terms of how you think about this, is that they're basically captured by a kind of a fairly stable set of interest groups. Maybe it's a democratic coalition, maybe it's union-based, maybe it's developers, in some places obviously developer-based coalitions that have power. And this is a critique, right, of city power straight up, which is you don't have good party competition there, you don't have alternatives, and it's easy for those folks to take advantage and keep a stable, say, majority that restricts, that's either oppressive or that needs to be checked by the state, by state legislative kind of oversight. And I'm just a little less, maybe I'm just a little skeptical about those forces. I think those forces exist. Certainly, let's say developer interests or interests that are, there's some things like the subsidy stuff. There are interests in the city who are very ready to commit significant subsidies to corporations, and they exercise a lot of power. So let's say the real estate industry exercise a lot of power. And that's a problem. Now, it turns out historically and in this book and elsewhere, I'm just more skeptical that the state processes will be any better. And so I align with Frederick Howe, sort of a progressive reformer from the 19th and 20th, late 19th and early 20th century. And Howe said, listen, local governments, city governments, corrupt and terrible and can be awful, but the state legislature is worse. And so let's get the state legislature out of the game. And we have quotes from early on about that too in the book. Let's get the state legislature out of the game and then work on doing whatever reformist thing you want to do, whatever it happens to be, at the city level. And what I'm seeing, and maybe you're seeing something different, but what I do think you see is, yes, there are corrupt local governments, there's entrenched local governments, there are mayors that are there for 30 years and they're not doing anything great. But we're seeing more and more reformist political processes in these places, and I think they're just as effective. The entrenchment at the state legislative level is unbelievable, right? New York State is a good example. It's democratically dominated, but they just broke the kind of entrenchment of the kind of quasi-Republican legislature, and the corruption is very, so I just think the state process, you've got to decide which one. I don't under any impression that local government processes, political processes, are any less corruptible or corrupted or captured. But I think you're doing a comparison, and it seems to me the state legislative processes are pretty bad themselves. And so at that point, I moved to the local and then we fight there. That's kind of the idea.
Thanks.
Excellent. Let's move on. I think another question, just because these are great questions. This one comes from Ben, a pal of mine, Ben Nathan. Do you want to ask it, or would you like me to ask it? I'll give it a. Excellent. He says, are there any other countries you look to as demonstrating exemplary national, federal, and city relationships?
Oh, that's a good question. I need to do more comparative work. I don't know the answer to this. I talk a little bit about Paris and France in the book. We've seen some articles recently about the conflicts there with a highly centralized system. The thing I cite in the book about that is that the mayor of Paris, maybe other mayors, have a certain amount of influence in a otherwise highly centralized government. And that's because they can hold national office while they're the mayor. They have influence. And again, this is about the political dynamics rather than the structure necessarily of the government. So this is a highly centralized European state or nation. And the mayors seem to have some authority. Now, there's a recent article in the New York Times about how the center in France is having similar conflicts with local government officials, and that hasn't been working out that well. I think we probably see these kinds of conflicts in other places. Often Germany is cited as a place where kind of the regional governments and the equivalent of states or landers have a better relationship with the center. I don't have great comparative knowledge on that. What people do try to do is compare federal systems, but that's really hard to do because it's hard to say what a federal system is and what it looks like. So we have a certain kind of state-based, what I call U.S.-style state-based federalism. It's not clear that we can compare ourselves to other kinds of federal systems, but I do mention also in the book that, you know, where cities are directly represented qua cities in the central government and national legislatures, they're going to have more power. They're going to exercise more authority.
Awesome. So I have one more kind of point, and then we have a few more questions. You said you're available to stay on until around 7:30, so we can kind of get through a lot of these and keep asking questions, folks, if you've got more. My next kind of question is about, kind of stems from, there was a Politico article, a long form article that was released, I think late last year, don't quote me on that, but it kind of talked about the mess that is the redevelopment of Penn Station.
Yeah.
And the central thesis of this article was, yes, having a single person, a single point, and they're referring to Robert Moses, was a little bit too autocratic. And I think that if Robert Moses were around today, we wouldn't even see Penn Station.
Right.
But the other point that the author of this article makes is that one of the big roadblocks to getting anything done is there are too many competing interests. There's too many public and private partners and competitors and everyone who's got a stake in the outcome of the development of Penn Station. And my question to you, and I don't know if this is a reasonable question because it's all contextual, but is there an ideal place on that scale from total autocracy to total free-for-all where we might find
right.
development heaven or development actually moving forward on ideals that have good positive outcomes for the city?
Yeah, so this is tricky. I took a look at the article the other day. So I think the article in some ways supports my thesis, which is you have all this redundancy. Part of the issue there is that there's federal intervention, right? So you have a senator from New York, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. This is his project, right, to redo the station. What is the senator from the state of New York doing, right? In part, it's because the U.S. Postal Service's property, some other federal actors are implicated. And then there are all these state actors that are implicated too. They want a hand in this. They have redevelopment monies. They have certain kinds of authority too. And then there's the local. So you have this three-tiered system. That's always been the case. It's always been the case. So I don't see it as anything new. I think part of the thesis is, well, we're so worried about power being exercised that we've put up all these barriers. But the lesson I take from that is not that there were so many barriers, it's just a lot of players and a lot of them wanting to intervene, federal, state, and local officials. That's a feature of the three-tiered federalism. So I don't think it's about progressives being worried about the exercise of power, although I think Robert Mueller, for some reason, we've now got this, and this is not the only article. A lot of people are pushing kind of Robert's figure to big projects. A lot of big projects are terrible and just a disaster, and that's federal money coming down and intervening in these places. And I don't think that's something we want to repeat. So I have written, though, and you've seen this in the book, Sam, about having a strong mayor. That is somebody in the mayor's office that has authority. And so if you combine that with home rule, that doesn't mean a mayor gets to dictate what happens developmentally. That's crazy. That's a little nutty. Like we should have the mayor who builds big projects. It's not the mayor's job to build big projects. Other actors should engage in processes that lead to sensible and reasonable development. That development process is a tough one and it's a political one, but we have to be really sensitive to it because talk about capture. It's just like the mayor just handing goodies to private developers so that they can use the city as their kind of real estate piggy bank. That is not what we want. That's a big mistake. So catastrophic money versus normal money. And I think when mayors and governors and presidents want to do big giant projects, that you might be nervous about that. Let's support the neighborhoods and the people in those places that make the city a place where working class people can become middle class people. It's not clear that building a giant train station is the way to do that. I'm not against that, but you worry a little bit about what that means.
It doesn't seem to me that anyone's really publicly asked the question, what's the point of Penn Station?
Right.
And obviously nominally it's to get people in and out of their train travel, but is it also a regional attractor for jobs and shoppers? Is it a place to hang out? Does it have to be the topper or directly underneath Madison Square Garden? There's a lot of questions. And I think what you get is a lot of people who, they have this noblesse oblige, the good government, capital good government. I know what's best for you, and you're going to take your medicine. And I think that to really get, I'm not really sure how to unstick Penn Station. I'm not really sure anybody is either. But it's definitely worth talking about. And I think, reading the book, you'll really get a sense of coming up with your own explanation of what the cause and maybe what a potential outcome could be. Got a question from Jonathan Gifford. He says, and I think we touched on this a little bit, but I think he wants to dive a little bit more into how do you interpret how HQ2 unfolded in New York City?
Oh, so, it's hard to say. I think, and I followed it the way others maybe followed it on, and there may be people with more better knowledge on this call about the ins and outs of this. I followed it the way others did, sort of following it in the newspapers. But what I saw was, here's what I've asked, and I asked my urban law and policy classes, why is New York City subsidizing corporate location? Why are they giving incentives? Why is Washington, D.C. doing that? Why is Chicago doing that? Right? All these places that have benefited from the urban resurgence where property values have risen dramatically, it strikes me as bizarre that you would need to give location incentives to companies when you are thriving, at least at a certain level of the market. And you see this in Charlottesville. Charlottesville has also benefited from the urban resurgence. It's a small place, so as the decline and the growth are much smaller. But why is Charlottesville giving tax incentives to internet companies, which they're doing at a very small scale, when the downtown real estate market is booming? I don't quite get it. So this just strikes me as very strange to do this if your economy is doing fine. And maybe there's a thought that, well, it's not doing fine, or certain kinds of jobs aren't here, or we want to ensure that it's doing fine forever, and we need to bring jobs and so on. But this strikes me as very strange. And it seems to me that the local residents who were resistant to this, and there was a NIMBY aspect to this, so I get nervous about that for sure. But the local residents seem to have this better, which is we don't need this. It's not clear why you would spend this kind of money to hand this money over to this giant corporation when we could either use that money for other things. Again, to me, it's basic municipal services, or you could not spend it in this way. You could spend it in other ways. So I just find all these practices, these local practices of giving away, I call them giveaways, right? That's what these are, giveaways to mobile capital. I find them very strange, especially in already robust, economically robust places that have enjoyed the fruits of the urban resurgence. It's also a problem for the new Londons of the world, because I don't think they're going to be successful. But at least you have a rationale for them, or at least you think you have a rationale.
I think it's sort of two things. I think it's a lot of political grandstanding. You can metaphorically cut a ribbon that you did a thing as a city councilor or as a state legislator, that you're making the effort to bring jobs to your constituents. I think it's an incredibly shrewd move from Amazon. I think Amazon, the folks who are in charge of real estate and kind of siting, also understand horizontal federalism. And I think that by creating the competition that may or may not have been there, by kind of artificially boosting the competition, I think it spooked a lot of places that may or may not have needed to submit an application at all, or who maybe wouldn't have given tax breaks otherwise. And I guess the takeaway here is too, that even though Amazon isn't building a new headquarters here, thousands of Amazon jobs are still coming to New York.
Right. This is the reverse. This is just the, yeah.
There might be different jobs, and there are a lot of things to say about the type of worker who's going to be moving into the community. And I don't want to get into gentrification here. People who know me know how I feel about that word, and people who don't, I think it's a politically charged word that means almost nothing. That being said, let's go back to the questions. I think that people don't want to hear me talk, they want to hear you talk. So can you talk about the difference between trying to attract capital to a metro area versus trying to determine where I think it chooses to locate within a metro area?
Oh, so trying to attract capital versus trying to determine where the capital chooses to locate. So yeah, I guess there's different ways to think about this, which is, so your workers, residents, businesses have to come, or get to make decisions about a metropolitan area or a region. First, they might make a decision about a region of the country. Then they have to make the decision whether they're going to be in the city, in the county, in a different place, in Groton, in New London, these kinds of things. And it turns out these can be zero-sum games, because if you locate in the city, they get the tax benefits. If they locate out of the city, the county gets the tax benefits. And even in Charlottesville and the surrounding county, there's a long history of competing for ratables. And this is the race to the bottom. This is what happens is the company says, well, you want the ratables, what do you give us? And that's the way this is working. And that's what Amazon was on a grand scale. There's also, and that, I think that race is a problem. That's a problem. Now, some people say, you're right, that's a problem, but you know what's not a problem? Creating an environment in your community or in your city or in your town or in your region that is amenable and attractive to people to come. So that's where, say, the arts districts come in, or the amenities, or supporting small businesses. So there's stuff to do, so that there's, let's say, a music festival or something like that. And that to me is what I would call kind of an amenity chasing model. And that's not clear that that works either, or that it's right. If everybody's doing that, every small town, for example, has an arts festival, or in Charlottesville, there's music and book festivals and all kinds of stuff. If everybody's doing that, then it's all even, right? And if everybody has a sports team or whatever it is. On the other hand, if you think about the timing, and I ask this question of my students also. So in Charlottesville, when the downtown was in fiscal distress, they decided to close the street and make it a downtown mall, right? A pedestrian mall. This was to attract people back to the downtown. Lots of places did this in the country. And I asked the students, did that cause the urban resurgence in Charlottesville, this downtown mall? And they say, of course it did, of course it did. And then I described to them two things. One, lots of cities did this, and then they removed these pedestrian malls later because they didn't work at all. And two, Charlottesville didn't remove it because they didn't have the money, and it took 10 or 15 years before the downtown started to resurge, and it resurged just like other downtowns that never had pedestrian malls. So it was just the fact that the pedestrian mall happened to be there, and then you get the urban resurgence. So it turns out the timing is all off for these things. So the intervention to try to attract people with amenities, usually if you look closely, the urban resurgence happened already and the amenities followed, not the other way around. That's important causally. We see that with business improvement districts. We see this with tax increment financing. You'll see this in the book. It's actually, and this is for folks, it's sometimes hard to hear, you are doing the thing that was already going to happen. It was already going to happen because the urban resurgence came in first, or started, and then the amenities followed in most cases. So I think that's a response a little bit to the, can we just improve the locational desirability of a place? Won't that do something? And I don't think it works that way.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with that answer. One thing I will say, as a planner and not a lawyer, being on the ground in a lot of these places, what you see, and it's very hard to tell, like what you're saying, like what the cause of the outcome is. I mean, in statistics, you can run tests to try to figure out which thing caused this thing, the urban resurgence to happen. And a lot of times it's inconclusive. And what the real takeaway is, you have a lot of these kind of happenstance events that kind of happen all at once. And it's very hard to predict what's coming. It's very hard to predict. And like you say in the book, there's no evidence that any of the interventions or the lack of intervention have provided anything at all. So everyone should just pack up and go home. That being said, there's like what you're saying about providing municipal services. I think making a place more walkable and bikeable, kind of devoid or decoupled from economic development, is a good city goal. And I think it's politically popular too, because the adage is, if cars don't buy things, people buy things. And so if you make a place more accessible to more people, I think you're going to start seeing the urban resurgence. But you don't want to necessarily, it's harder to unpack that, I think, as if you're not necessarily focused on providing better walking and biking. That's just my take on that. As a planner who sort of is against planning in a way, I'm such a misanthrope in this industry. I care about shovel-ready type things, and so the process of planning, I think that's a Churchill quote. The process of planning, or maybe Eisenhower is one of these leaders in the 40s and 50s, talks about the process of planning and getting your ducks in a row. But I think another great book that everybody read this book, but another great book is Order Without Design, Alain Berthoud's book, who kind of talks about You know, the planners saying there's going to be density in this district and playing with colors on a map does not necessarily make it true.
Correct.
And I think, you know, all of these theories and these books should be read sort of together in a way. And, you know, like the process of planning and economic development, the ideas start to meld when you kind of take a lot of different theory and opinion. And yeah, it's definitely taken me 6 years since I started grad school to just scratch the surface. Question from Jarrett. Jarrett says, and I love this question, is there a benefit to having urban planners and urbanists run for political office, state or local, understanding that there is deep historical and policy-driven knowledge present within the urban planning discipline? Or are there better ways for urban planners to spend their time strengthening city authority? I love that question.
Yeah, so I think all kinds of people should run for local office, planners among them. You know, people who have some knowledge, obviously, of these kinds of processes, but are also self-aware. There's a certain kind of self-awareness. But I talk to law students all the time, and what I'm urging them to do is get into local government and city government, state government also, because their inclination is to go off to big law firms in big places. They're going to live in these places, but they're not as directed towards the local in the way that we should be. And I'm influenced, right? The two biggest influences on me are Jane Jacobs and Louis Brandeis. And Brandeis famously said, you know, go home, but he told his law clerks, go back to your states, go do your work there. Don't focus so much on the central government, on the national government. And we lose sight of that often because we think central is better. It's going to be more resourced, which is sometimes true. It's going to be more competent in certain places, in certain ways, or less, as we've seen more recently, I think. And you can do big projects there. There's just more money. But I think what we're seeing is a little bit of a revival of states and cities as places where real work is happening and really good, innovative work is happening. And the minimum wage movement is one of those movements, right? The minimum wage movement starts in cities. If you had said to people 5-10 years ago, there will be minimum wage movements in cities, they would have said you're crazy. Especially economists would have said you're nuts. You cannot have a minimum wage set at the municipal level. It will not work. Labor will flee, business will flee, labor will pour in. This is not going to be good for anybody. Turns out the cities drive this. They drive minimum wage movements at the state level, at the national level. It's not going to go anywhere. But so I think that's right. I think the answer to that is yes. Go become, if you're a planner, go and strengthen city power there. If you're working for cities, which often planners are doing, it can be hard, right? The politics of the city can be quite challenging. For all the reasons, Sam, you're mentioning and what Greg mentioned. Politics is tricky. It's developer interests, it's right. But there are lots of things you can do in that space, obviously, to improve lots of things. What I don't think planners should be doing is trying to figure out how to create economic growth. What they should be doing is creating maybe aesthetically beautiful places or equitable places or spaces that work for people. I think that's really the job. But that's what I would say about anybody working in local government.
I totally agree with that. I love that question. It doesn't even have to be city level. It can be hyper local. Join your local community. Like go to the community board meetings in New York, or join your ANC in DC. And I'm not sure what the equivalent in Chicago and the other cities are, but go participate. That's just as effective in some ways as running for office, but it takes a special kind of person to be able to take that sort of beating from your constituents, or a special kind of ego. We have one last question, I think. It's from a gentleman named Jason. He has a question for you, but I kind of want to take a half stab at it first. What's the opinion of the strategy of cities investing heavily in educational institutions and the areas around them as a way to retain graduates and attract industries. Our city is doing this too much, not enough. Does this effectively lead to economic prosperity? I want to give a quick example about this. My last job, I got two former colleagues on this. I work for a company called Smart Growth America, Transportation for America. It's an advocacy firm and a white hat technical assistance firm based out of DC. And one of the projects we worked on was called Cool and Connected. I did not choose this name, but the gist of this project was we would, with the help of the USDA, the EPA, and the Appalachian Regional Commission, kind of choose competitively 20 or so cities or small towns across the country to help them figure out how best to leverage broadband access to kind of create economic opportunity. And one of the reasons we were chosen is because of our experience with revitalizing downtowns. And my point is, I know that was kind of a dull anecdote, but my point is we went to a place called Portsmouth, Ohio. It sits on the Ohio River, kind of the junction of the Ohio and the Scioto Rivers at the very south end of Ohio. And they're home to a university. They have Shawnee State. It's part of the Ohio public university system. They tout themselves as a great university for kind of a regional bunch of folks to study video game design and plastics. That's what they care about. That's their bread and butter. And one of the thoughts that we got, one of the pieces of feedback when we were doing our initial fact finding was, despite this presence of this educational institution, students were fleeing Portsmouth after graduation. And you can see in the demographics, I did a little dive into it, in that the percentage of 18 to 24 does not necessarily track the percentage of 24 to 30. And what you hear is people are spending their time at Shawnee State. It's more affordable likely than Ohio State, but then going 2 hours north to Columbus, which is a regional job and a national job attractor. I mean, countrywide or nationwide insurance is there. Now, the corollary to this is that they're also building a $1.3 billion bypass, a highway, to try to attract a new cracker coke processing plant. So the combination of all these things, and to kind of rephrase the question, kind of put it to you now, is despite Portsmouth having a university and despite there being likely job opportunities there, why are people leaving? So should Portsmouth invest more or not? Long anecdote.
Yeah, right. So I mean, this is one of the claims is eds and meds, right? You should invest in eds and meds. So medical and education facilities. It turns out it's not that easy to invest in educational. You can try to start a new university, but most of these cities are embedded. And there's something to that, right? So University of Virginia here in Charlottesville is embedded and it's not going anywhere. It's not able to move. It can't flee, right? So it's relatively immobile. And when you have a relatively immobile industry, that's better for your economy. The truth is automobile plants in Detroit were relatively immobile too, because they were billion-dollar fixtures in the city of Detroit. And yet eventually they leave too. So there are lots of location-specific investments that look pretty immobile until they're not. But universities seem to be a place, and they seem to create an educated workforce, and education seems to connect up with economic development. So people say, well, the more educated workforce you have, or more educated residents, that correlates with economic growth. But we don't know what the causation is. Again, we don't know if the causation is in the direction of educated people leads to growth, or it's growth leads to educated people pouring in. And it seems to me it's likely the opposite actually might be the way this goes. The other thing to say, for example, Charlottesville, Philadelphia, any of these places with lots of universities or one big university, Charlottesville's downtown was in serious decline. And the university hadn't changed at all. The university was the same university over the last 50 years. It has a few more students than it had. But in 1989, when the city's in decline and the university's there. So it's not like the university prevented decline or creates mechanisms by which decline doesn't happen. Decline happened, and then we got a resurgence that follows about 10 years later or so, or whatever the timing was. So the universities happen to be right now places that people want to be in, college towns and various other things, but they happen to want to be in all kinds of places. Las Vegas, which doesn't have, it's not an eds and meds kind of place. Um, um, these are locations that had existing eds and meds and nothing happened, and then suddenly something happened. So again, the causation is really, really problematic in my mind. And so, yes, if you have an educational institution and you're trying to keep people, I don't really know what that even means, right? To keep people, right? Again, labor markets are regional or national, right? And people are going to go, and they're not going, again, it's where the jobs are. Now you could then try to attract a job creating entity. But again, that might work, it might not. Like the chances of it working are, it's as good as doing anything else, right? So when people say, oh, it's a good place to raise a family, they have good schools. I'll give you another example. The urban resurgence, there's a whole chapter on what caused the urban resurgence. That is what caused the resurgence of downtown city places, which were in quite severe decline in the United States and elsewhere, frankly, in lots of places. And people say, well, they got better education systems, K through 12. Turned out that's not true. The data doesn't show that. They reduced crime. Turns out that wasn't true either. Crime reductions come after people start coming, or at least the causation is, oh, they had eds and meds. Well, they always had eds and meds, right? Like lots of these places, the universities had never gone anywhere. It was not like they came back. The hospitals had never gone anywhere. It's not like they came back. Amenities, they had better amenities. They made the waterfront more picturesque or something like that. Turns out none of that had happened. It's like the Charlottesville example. So I just think there are a lot of efforts to get a silver bullet or a secret that will attract and keep people and create an economically robust space in your town or wherever it is. And I just think they're all mistakes. I don't think they're proven in any way.
So the one corollary or the one kind of example I might use to kind of not counter, but kind of add to the discussion here is Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh had a very interesting story of resurgence after the decline of its main industry, steel, kind of either shed overseas and a lot of folks moved from Pittsburgh down to the Sun Belt. There's a great kind of southern migration there. But here is what I found when I did a little research into this, because I wanted to know why Pittsburgh, why not Columbus, why not Detroit, why not any of these other Rust Belt cities? And it had to do with a combination of things. It was very hard to predict. There were two universities whose presidents and boards were very urban minded and understood the type of work and the type of stakeholders they had to partner with. There were a local coalition of champions. I think it was called Century 21, the group, where the champions kind of really made the power play to kind of get all the folks who needed to have an opinion equitably to bring back Pittsburgh. And location was important too. It's a beautiful city, and there were a lot of strong bones there, but there were a lot of different, one might say, competing interests that went to kind of taken together, kind of create, I don't know, maybe let's use a TV analogy here, the Avatar of The Last Airbender, it's all the things together. And really hard to tell which thing affected, because the overall outcome of the resurgence of Pittsburgh, because, while it's not New York, it's definitely an attractive place to go. And you'll get friends saying, hey, let's take a flight, or hey, let's drive to Pittsburgh to visit.
Yeah.
That's just kind of my take on Pittsburgh, and I think that it could have been any other reason too. Honestly, it's very hard to say. But lastly, I want to end this on sort of contentious. I want to get your take on who's disagreed with you.
Yeah.
But after releasing this book, I'm sure you've gotten a lot of pushback, or some pushback from colleagues and other very smart people. who disagrees with you about kind of any of the takeaways?
Well, so I think some of the discussion we're having is a form of disagreement, which is, again, I'm quite skeptical about the causation and the ability for cities to use certain kinds of policies to affect their growth and decline, and that's not popular with anybody. It's not a position that right, the competitive model assumes a certain kind of agency for cities, and that they can do bad things and they can do good things. If they do good things, they're more likely to prosper, and if they do bad things, they're much more likely not to prosper. And so I have a different view of agency, and it's not consistent with a lot of people's position on that. They think, no, there's actually good policy and bad policy in this realm. So I get pushback on that. The other thing I get pushback is on fiscal federalism. So the claim is, and we're seeing this in the pandemic, which is the aversion to bailouts, and the assumption that local governments have to have what people call a hard budget constraint. That is, they cannot be helped by higher level governments, or they will not engage in good government. I call this the disciplinary theory of competitive federalism. So the disciplinary theory, remember, is you can't help these guys out if they're doing badly, because they're probably doing badly because of corruption or some other thing. And if we come in and try to fix that with a higher level government, say this national or state government funding, right? That's a bailout, and it won't incentivize those folks to fix themselves up. So when you talk about Detroit, you're going to get people saying, well, the reason Detroit declined is because they were mismanaged. And we can't bail them out, because if you bail them out, they'll just be mismanaged again. So you got to fix that. You got to have a hard budget constraint on them. And I think that's crazy, because obviously my thesis is, yes, you can have bad governance. You can have corrupt governance even. But in fact, the cities in the industrial period grew the fastest and became the richest during a period when they were most corrupt, or at least people thought they were most corrupt, during Tammany Hall and that period. That is, and then there are places with very good government, very clean government, very early on, and they declined. And so I'm trying to detach the kind of, you did a bad job, city, you governed in a bad way, you're corrupt, from economic growth and decline. And I don't see the link to that. And there's resistance to that for sure, obviously, because there's an urgency, there's a felt need to link up bad governance and decline. And I don't see it. I don't see the links.
Again, it's I think a sliding scale on what the populace is willing to accept or willing to look the other way. And that's, again, unpopular, because we want to have trust and faith in the institutions that are going to act in full faith and to fulfill the duties of their office. But there's nothing that's saying how they have to accomplish it, right? There's no, unless there's I'm sure there's rules, right, of conduct, but rules can be broken.
I think, Sam, good government is a good in and of itself, right? Not corrupt, all that stuff is good. I just don't see a tight relationship between good government and economic growth or decline in a city. I just think the evidence is somewhat contrary to that, frankly. You can have very, very good government, very clean government, and you can decline just as fast as if you had super corrupt government. And again, the massive growth in industrial cities there was significant amounts of corruption. Corruption is bad. I don't think it's good. I think clean government is better than dirty government, but that's for other reasons. And we want to keep those reasons separate from the growth reasons.
And on that note, I think we're at 7:30. So I want to end with two things. First, I'm going to post a link to the book in the chat.
Nice.
Everyone, please support your local bookstore if you can. So I've posted a link to IndieBound. Obviously, you can find it on, Giant Death Robot site. I don't want to name it. It's May Day. It's not really fair to name that site today, but you can grab it at your local bookstore. I'm sure they would really appreciate it, and I'm sure our professors would also appreciate it. Lastly, where can people reach you if they have more questions? Is there a
So
great way?
I'm here at Virginia. I'm in my home office, settled in, but schrager@virginia.edu is my email. You can reach me.
And you have a Twitter as well, right? I don't know how responsive you are, but you tweet. That's how I got in touch with you.
Yeah, I tweet. I'm trying to tweet. I'm new to Twitter. I'm not very good at it.
Honestly, stay away for your health. Really,
it does stress,
Greg up in the corner says no.
stresses me out so terribly, and I just have to be calm about it. But it is anxiety provoking. But I feel like it's nice to be on there and just to push some ideas out. And we got to meet this way, so that was great. That was terrific. A real benefit.
So I posted the link. I'm sure you'd appreciate a follow. You can always Google them, and if you forget the email address, it comes up kind of first. And yeah, so in terms of this video, everybody, it'll be posted on my blog, my website, but also I'm sure I'm going to send a copy to Professor Schrager as well, and he can feel free to distribute it if he sees fits. If you want to kind of follow me, I'm at Sam Sklar, so at SAMSKLAR, and from there you can kind of see my terrible takes and some good takes too.
Yeah.
Very thankful for Twitter. I got to
Sam's
connect.
got a newsletter. You should follow Sam's newsletter.
I do have a newsletter. The link is available in that, and that's mostly talking about federal transportation policy, which is my, I guess, niche, if you will. Like everyone talks about niching, and that's my niche. So I want to thank everyone for coming out. I know everyone's super busy, so really appreciate, even though we're not really supposed to go out, everyone's keeping busy doing a lot of good work. So I want to thank everyone for spending an hour and a half with us. And yeah, hope to connect with you offline, and maybe we'll have another chat with another author, or if Rich wants to come back and join a moderated panel, we'll talk about it. This can be a thing. We can keep this going. So appreciate everybody coming out. Have a great night, and bye everyone.
Thanks everybody. Appreciate it.